So we're really excited to present our project this summer. And what we worked on was a way to control gene expression speed through genetic parts. So normally in iGEM, when we characterize our genetic parts, we like to characterize them in terms of their steady state properties or their static effects. And so for example, we look at ribosome binding sites and we think about them in terms of their effects on static or steady state gene expression. And we think of transcription factors in terms of their effect on the structures of gene networks. But when we focus exclusively on these static properties, what we miss out on are the more complex and interesting dynamical properties of genetic parts and circuits. And so what our project aims to do is to enable teams to access the full potential of their genetic parts and circuits through a modular engineering philosophy. Okay, so how does this relate to speed, and how are we going to control speed? So mathematical biologists have been predicting that speed and degradation rate are related. And this might seem a little counterintuitive, so we're going to need to walk through a math model first formulated by Yuri Alon in 2009 for this to make sense. So consider that we have some activatable or inducible gene that encodes for some protein X that's produced at some rate alpha and degraded at some rate gamma. And with those parameters, we can make a differential equation that explains how the concentration of protein X is changing over time. And we can solve that for the amount or concentration of protein X at some time t. And so now we need to explicitly define what are we talking about when we're talking about speed. And we want to talk about speed relative to steady state, so how quickly we're getting to steady state, which is alpha over gamma, production over degradation. And since X is going to asymptotically approach the steady state, what we need to do then is use half that value instead. And we're going to call that tau. And explicitly, what tau is the amount of time that it takes for X to get halfway to its steady state value. And if you solve the above equations, you can get that tau is actually equal to the natural log of 2 divided by gamma. And so what that means is that if you want to control tau, or speed, you need to control degradation rate. And so if we want a modular parts-based way to control speed, we need a modular parts-based way to control degradation. So how are we going to do that? The system we chose to use was developed by Collins and Cameron in 2014 and is called the MF-lon protease system. And so it consists of an MF-lon protease and associated PDTs, which are short amino acid sequences which tag or target a given protein for degradation by the MF-lon protease. And each of these tags has a distinct protease affinity and thus a distinct degradation rate. And importantly, this protease and PDT system is completely E. coli orthogonal. That means the PDTs are not degraded by any endogenous E. coli proteases, and this MF-lon protease does not degrade or interact with any E. coli proteins. So the first thing we wanted to do then was characterize this degradation rate of these different PDTs on iGEM plasmid backgrounds. And so on this graph, the y-axis is going to be degradation rate relative to an untagged control. And so the higher we are on the graph, the higher the degradation rate, the stronger the tag. And all of the data you see throughout this presentation is going to be calibrated flow cytometric data, and so absolute fluorescence of single cells. And on this graph, each data point represents the geometric mean of at least 10,000 single cell fluorescence measurements. And what you can see of different biological reference. And so what you can see is that each PDT has a distinct degradation mean. So that's great. But what we really want to talk about is speed. So we need to use an inducible construct just like we were talking about in the math model. And so we took time course facts data. And so here, this is a time course of our control condition with no PDT, no external MF-lon. And in this case, instead of showing you all the biological replicates for each protein degradation tag, we're taking the geometric mean of 3 biological replicates and showing you the geometric standard deviation as the shaded region. And so, if you're thinking about speed here, you can look at where this crosses on the normalized fluorescence axis. And we're normalizing to steady state here. And so we're normalizing to steady state here because we want to talk about when we're crossing over 0.5 on the y-axis, because that's inherently our measure of speed. Alternatively, you can just look at where the top of the graph is, because this is a real biological system, so we are actually reaching a real steady state. And so you can just look there instead. And in order for you guys to be able to actually see that, we're truncating our graphs once we reach steady state, and that data is available on parts pages and on our wiki. And so then what are we going to expect to see? Well, we expect to see that as I add stronger and stronger degradation tags and increase the degradation rate, we're going to see an increase in speed. And that's going to look like a shift to the left. And in fact, as we add stronger and stronger degradation tags, we do in fact see increasing shifts to the left. And that's really great. But the other question is, we know there's this relationship between speed and degradation, but is it the one that our model predicts? So if you recall earlier, we said that speed is related to the inverse of degradation. And if we plotted that out, it would look something like this. And so it's important to note at this point that there's never actually been, and to our knowledge at least, an experimental confirmation of the relationship, the inverse scaling relationship between speed and degradation. And so we were really excited to find that our data does in fact appear to be congruent with our model's prediction of this inverse scaling between degradation rate and speed. And so to our knowledge, this is the first experimental confirmation of this fundamental inverse scaling relationship between speed and degradation.
However, you might recall that we've called steady state alpha over gamma, or production rate over degradation rate. This means that as we're increasing degradation rate in order to gain control over speed, we're effectively decreasing our steady state values. Now, in many applications, what you really care about is relative gene expression, or simply whether a gene is on or off. However, ideally, we would like our speed control system to be independent of any other gene expression properties. Well, luckily, if you look at our definition of speed, or tau, we see that it's only a function of gamma, our degradation rate. This means that we should be able to readjust our steady state back to its original value by simply increasing alpha, our production rate, without having any effect on the speed change. So to demonstrate this empirically, we're going to show you another time course experiment, and notice now that our y-axis is absolute fluorescence and not normalized fluorescence. So when we add our protein degradation tag, we see the expected decrease in our steady state value, and we're easily able to readjust the steady state back to its original value by increasing our production rate. And in this case, we did that by increasing the induction of our inducible reporter construct. But what we really care about here is the speed change, right? So if our speed control is truly independent of production and steady state as we expect, then our two protein degradation tag conditions are going to show the same change in speed, regardless of the difference in their induction value. So to demonstrate this, we're going to move back to our normalized fluorescence scale. So I'm showing you the same time course data as before, just switching the scale back to normalized. So when we add our protein degradation tag, again, we see the expected speed change. And we are very excited to find that when we add our induced, higher induction condition, the speed change was maintained. This is telling us that our speed control is completely independent of any other gene expression properties, such as production rate and steady state value. So our next step was to go on and demonstrate a more interesting and complex aspect of dynamic circuit behavior. So to do that, we looked at the incoherent feed-forward loop, or IFFL circuit, and this is a pulse-generating circuit. So when we take a closer look at this circuit architecture, we find that we can actually control the shape of the pulse that's generated by simply manipulating the interactions between different nodes of our circuit. For instance, if we increase the activation of Z by X, we're able to increase the slope of our initial rise to the peak of our pulse. Likewise, if we increase the repression of Z by Y, we're able to affect the width of our pulse by increasing the sharpness with which we drop back down to our steady state value. So we were actually able to create an IFFL circuit using our protein degradation tag system. And we did this by simply replacing the first node of our circuit with a simultaneous induction of our MF-lon protease and our tagged reporter construct. This circuit architecture enabled us to control both aspects of the shape of our pulse simply by swapping out the protein degradation tag on our reporter construct. So we expect that when we use a stronger protein degradation tag, that the pulse generated by the circuit is going to be sharper. So we first wanted to show that we could actually build this IFFL circuit using our PDT system. And that's what I'm showing you here. We have another time course experiment, and this is of our strongest protein degradation tag with the simultaneous induction of our protease and our tag reporter. And we do see the characteristic pulse-like behavior of an IFFL circuit. But we wanted to make sure that this pulse was actually a result of an IFFL rather than just being an inherent property of our PDT system. So to do that, we took the same construct and broke the circuit architecture by pre-inducing our MF-long protease. And with that condition, we see a gradual rise to some steady state, which is telling us that the simultaneous condition is actually showing an IFFL circuit using our PDT system. Our next step was to see if we could actually control the shape of our pulse simply by swapping out the protein degradation tag that we use on our reporter. So again, we expect that as we decrease the strength of the protein degradation tag that we use, we're going to see an increase in the width of our pulse. So again, I begin with our strongest protein degradation tag, and as we decreased the strength of the tag that we used, we did in fact see an increase in the width of the pulse generated. And this was really exciting for us because this is telling us that we were able to affect the dynamic behavior of a genetic circuit simply by swapping out a single genetic part. So our next step was to make this PDT system as easy to use and accessible to other teams as possible. And to aid in that effort, we wanted to build a mathematical model for something called the protease saturation effect. Now this is going to come into play when we're looking at larger, more complex circuits, or generally when you have a really large number of proteins that are tagged for degradation. So when you reach a large enough number of tagged proteins relative to the amount of protease that you're expressing, you're going to reach a point of saturation. And this means that each tagged protein is going to experience a lower functional degradation rate than normally you would expect. And this is going to affect our ability to control speed. So we built a mathematical model, and we parameterized that model using Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling. And we wanted to track the effect of protein load concentration on fold speed change, which we defined as the difference between the speed change for our tagged construct versus our untagged construct. So when we simulated our model, we found that there was a sharp decrease in the fold speed change when our load concentration reached a saturated threshold value. And we further found that on the far right side of the graph, when our system is saturated, the fold speed change is close to 1. And this means that there's nearly no difference between our tagged construct and our untagged construct in terms of speed change. We also found by further manipulating our model that we're actually able to have control over the nature and shape of our saturation curve by simply changing different properties of the load. So our hope is that in the future, teams will be able to use this mathematical model along with our protein degradation tag system in order to have simple and predictable control over the speed and dynamics of their circuit while optimizing and avoiding the protease saturation effect.
We wanted to make it as easy as possible for you to use our system in your circuit next year. So we designed all of the parts that we submitted to the registry to be modular. So you can tag any protein using Gibson, 3/8, or Golden Gate assembly. Our hope is that one day the term PDT will be as common as RBS, because controlling the properties of dynamical circuits will be as easy as swapping out a single genetic part. We wanted to show how easy it was for other teams to use our system, so we collaborated with UMaryland iGEM in order to do this. UMaryland developed a copper biosensor for their education outreach, and we attached our PDTs in order to make their circuit faster. So as you can see, as we increase the strength of our PDT, we are able to make their circuit respond more quickly. This is exciting because we helped them improve their circuit, but in addition to that, we are able to show how accessible our system is for other teams. To reflect this idea of accessibility in our human practices, we really made sure our outreach was guided by these three overarching ideas of having it be community-driven, adaptable, and sustainable. We did broad community outreach with students with the goal of educating them on synthetic biology. Our team and the students really benefited from this direct outreach, but we wanted to make sure that the impacts that we made doing this outreach lasted into the future. So in order to do that, we wanted to expand our outreach to teachers. We consulted with the School of Education at William & Mary to see how we could most effectively work with teachers. They gave us really important feedback. Specifically, they told us to improve our teaching materials and also to make sure that all of our education adhered to state learning requirements. In response to the feedback that we got from the School of Education and also feedback that we've gotten from iGEM teams over the years, we updated our 2015 synthetic biology booklet. We changed a lot of the activities to make them more relevant to the field of synthetic biology and also made sure that the age ranges of the activities better fit with, all of the activities better fit with different age ranges. We also made sure that the activities better fit to these overarching state and federal standards. Additionally, this booklet is freely available on our wiki for anyone to download and use in their own outreach. Additionally, we worked with science coordinators and teachers, and we wanted to see how we could integrate our goal of educating students on synthetic biology with their needs. Based on their feedback, we distributed our teaching materials, and we also made several opportunities for high school students to come into our college and do their own synthetic biology research projects. Additionally, going forward, we have scheduled several lab visits for teachers, and we will be hosting teacher workshops for synthetic biology. We also realized that this overarching idea of having state learning requirements is very important to teachers, so we wanted to connect with the people who made these policies. During the summer, we connected with several legislators, but in particular, we formed a relationship with our state senator, Monty Mason. He was incredibly helpful in connecting us with leaders in the local education system, and additionally, we built a long-lasting relationship with him that will last for years to come. We also did a lot of other outreach activities that you can look at on our wiki. But something that we noticed while we were doing our own outreach was how difficult it is to look at past human practices projects in iGEM. We have this really great infrastructure for wet lab research in the form of the Registry of Standard Biological Parts, but there is no analogous database or registry for outreach projects. So our solution was that we created an outreach database with 1,439 outreach projects from all the gold medal teams in the past 2 years. It's comprehensive, standardized, and searchable, so any team in the future can look back at past outreach projects to inform how they design their future outreach. They can look at what worked and what didn't work, and they can also synthesize past approaches to come up with new and innovative ways to approach outreach. So this is just how the wiki appears on the database appears on our wiki. It's searchable by keyword, and we also coded everything using tags, so it's super easy to look up projects by the different categories. Not only is our database a really useful tool for iGEM teams, the scientific community, and educators, it's also really useful for social scientists to analyze how outreach has been done in the past in iGEM. Something in particular that we found that we wanted to highlight is that there's a lot of information on project characteristics on wikis, so these are things that can be documented before an outreach project actually occurs. But there tends to be a lack of documentation on project outcomes. This makes it really difficult for future teams to build off the work that's already been done for outreach. So, based on the lessons that we learned from compiling our outreach database, we documented our own outreach in a very standardized and clear way, with the hope that future teams can build off the work that we did and that we can contribute to this idea of community-driven progress in iGEM. So, for our achievements this year, we implemented the PDT system for speed control. We performed what we believe is the first experimental validation of the scaling between speed and degradation rate. We showed that we can control speed independent of other gene expression properties. We showed that we can change the dynamical properties of circuits by simply swapping out a single genetic part. We designed our system and our model so that it's easy for you to use our PDTs in your circuit next year. We designed all of our outreach to make sure that our impacts last beyond the end of the Jamboree. And lastly, we created the outreach database, which we hope can be an example for an iGEM-sponsored repository for human practices work. So of course, we need to acknowledge everyone who got us here, and we'd especially like to acknowledge Dr. Dennis Manos, the Vice Provost for Research and Graduate Studies, our advisors, Dr. Margaret Saha, Dr. Greg Smith, HHMI, our graduate student advisor, John Markin, and our fantastic team. Thank you so much.